There was a time not that long ago in the grand scheme of things when every single day of human existence was focused on one thing, and that was survival. If you were a hunter-gatherer, your entire existence was spent gathering food, collecting water, chopping wood, staying alive. There was no excess, no comfort, no distractions, just pure survival. And then something changed. We learned how to farm. We became an agrarian society, started to gather into groups and built communities. And for the first time in human history, we were able to create a surplus. The food could be stored, water could be managed. And that changed everything, because now not everyone had to spend their whole day, surviving. Some people could build, some people could think, some people could create. And from there, we've just exponentially accelerated. We've had the Industrial Revolution, we've got technology, we've got global trade, and step by step, generation by generation, century by century, we've built the modern world around us today. A world more advanced than anything we've ever experienced as humanity. But here's the truth that no one wants to talk about. You see, the more advanced we've become, the more dependent or interdependent we've become as well. Today, over 70% of the world's population live in urban environments, and that's seen to increase in the near future. These cities, they can't feed themselves. They can't supply their own water. They cannot function without constant input from the outside world. All the food shipped in, all the fuels delivered, energy is distributed around the urban centres, and everything relies on everything and everyone else. Even the nations that we live in are not truly self-sufficient. Our food's imported, energy is shared between different countries, supply chains stretch across continents. We are no longer independent systems. We are one interconnected machine. And to be fair, it works beautifully until it doesn't. Because when you really stop and think about it, how many people do you know who could feed themselves if the system was disrupted or paused for some reason? How many could, capture and butcher an animal? How many could gather and collect clean water? People just think it comes in a cellophane packet in a supermarket, or you turn on a tap and that's where it is. How many people could genuinely function for over a week if the shelves were empty? Now, this isn't about fear. It's just about awareness. Because imagine this, and this isn't an end of the world scenario, or we can go down that route if you ever wanted to. It's not some big dramatic collapse, just a little disruption. The fuel supplies tighten, deliveries start to slow down, shelves start to empty, and we might even be seeing that in the near future because of the conflict in Iran. At first it's inconvenient, then it becomes uncomfortable, and then people really start to notice. The fuel stations get busy. People are putting on Facebook about, oh, don't go to that petrol station because it's ran out, and you start to see the queues gathering, and then instinctively you want to join that queue as well. People begin to worry. And this isn't even the point that everything's gone. It's just that people are starting to think, well, actually, how long is it going to last? Do I need to stock up on my toilet rolls like we saw in COVID? As a result of this, the supply chains start to stretch. Certain foods will become harder and harder to get. Energy needs to be managed more and more carefully. Now, there may not be constant blackouts at this point, but we might start seeing restrictions, limits. And, then all of a sudden something else is going to shift, because it's not necessarily now in the system, but in the people themselves. Because most people have never even had to consider survival. They've never had to go without. They've never had to ask. They've just been able to go to the shops, get what they want, to the fuel station, get what they want. But then they start to think, what happens if this doesn't come back on tomorrow? And when that question appears, so does something else. And you know what that is? Panic. And it's not everywhere. Some people are staying solid. Some people are staying calm, keeping their communities calm. But enough, and one after another, people start to panic. They're noticing the strain around them. And then it starts to expose them to just how fragile normal life really is. Here's the uncomfortable truth of it. Even if then the system came back online, even if everything then returned to normal, most people would still be just as unprepared as they were prior to this disruption, Because the issue isn't the system itself. As we've said earlier, the system works very well. It's our dependence on it. We've built a world where we rely on systems that we have no clue how they work. We don't control any of it. And the processes, all of the processes from oil refinery, butchery, water sanitation, all of the systems that we rely on to live a long and prosperous life, we'd have no clue how to replicate them if they all of a sudden disappeared. And again, this isn't fear, this is reality. Because in times like this, preparation is not panic, it's responsibility. And it's what capable men and women have always done since time immemorial. It's knowing that while you may not control the world and the systems that you find yourself in, you can control how ready you are to face any crises, and it's learning basic skills. It's learning how to make a fire, learning how to gather and store fruit and vegetables, making sure you understand where your food comes from. Have you got enough to see you through any disruption? I'm not talking about forever, or massive underground bunkers. I'm just talking about having enough so that if a crisis were to occur, you'd be okay for a couple of weeks, a month, and that is shifting from the passive to capable, prepared, resilient. Because the truth of it is this: if you don't rise to that level of expectation for yourself and your families, you're going to fall on your level or lack of preparation. And right now, most of us are not prepared at all. So don't just listen to this and don't act on it. Just think about what you could do. And if you would like me to take this further and actually show you how we can prepare, with various different methods, then let me know in the comments and we can do that next.